So what I'm going to be doing first of all is giving a little bit of a kind of introduction to the context, what it means when we start to talk about climate change and the climate emergency at a neighbourhood level. And then my colleague Helen Grimshaw, if she could just give a wave, is going to be talking a bit about some of the examples and tools and initiatives that we can maybe all learn from, sharing some of that. Okay, cool. So I suppose a few points I wanted to make. One is that when we talk about climate change, most often we're sharing graphs like this, big, scary, long-range graphs that have lots of numbers on them, and it takes a little bit of time to understand what this means. This is quite a famous one. This is the hockey stick graph. So this is about concentrations of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere over many, many thousands of years. But I guess what I would argue is that you don't really need to know all of the science to understand that climate change and the climate emergency are big issues. And people kind of realized that, and they started talking about polar bears instead. But that still feels like kind of quite a long way away from where a lot of us live. It's, you know, it's a cute animal, but it lives tens of thousands of miles away. And it's obviously been affected by climate change, but again, it's making it something other to what happens in our daily lives. Maybe more recently, we started to think about things like increased hurricanes, but they tend not to happen here very often. They're normally on the other side of the planet. They're happening now, but they're, you know, in places like the Caribbean. So it doesn't, again, it's not necessarily affecting our daily lives. It's starting to get weird things happening like this, which makes the climate emergency kind of encroaching on everyone's daily lives in odd ways. So this is from the wildfires in Oregon. Some people just happily playing golf while the forest behind them burns. Really odd. But I guess the point to make really is that all of these things are happening, and they're not some far off distant future. They're happening now, and they're happening where we live, in the northwest of England. So just a very small story about an old desk bureau. This was my granddad's desk, and it's in my aunt's house in Carlisle, which has now flooded twice in the last 15 years after never flooding prior to that. And it's kind of incredible to see what happens when something like that affects a member of your family. And how distressing it is, and what a big impact it has on their daily lives. My aunt, the first time her house flooded, she had to move out for 18 months and couldn't get back into the house for ages. She managed to fight to save the bureau. The people who do the flood insurance stuff want to get rid of it. But that's like a bit of the family heirloom that has been actually affected by climate change. So I wanted to do another poll now, actually, and just ask people, Laura, if you're able to tee it up. I'm not sure if you can do that while I'm screen sharing. Yes, excellent. So I wanted to ask, have you or any members of your family ever been affected by the climate emergency? I'll just give a couple of seconds. Okay, I'm gonna end it now. So almost half of people are saying that they haven't been affected at all. Some are saying maybe they have, some a little, and only one person in this group we have here has been affected by it a lot. So that is probably what you'd expect for a group of people largely from the northwest of England. I was also going to ask whether people had noticed any, let me share results. Laura, are you able to launch the next poll as well? Because I just wanted to ask if people have noticed any changes in their neighbourhood as the climate changes.
Was that launched, Marianne?
It doesn't look like it, but
hang on, I'll do it again.
It looks like we're still on the old one.
No.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah, so have you noticed any changes where you live that you think might be a result of a changing climate? And maybe if you want to stick in the chat what some of those things might be. So whether you've noticed, I just noticed the blossom on the tree coming out outside our living room window at the moment, and that's a little bit earlier than it has been in the past. Okay, great. So I will end the poll there. So people are starting to notice little changes. And I guess that's the point, that these little changes are liable to become bigger changes, but they're happening. So climate change is kind of here and now. Just to carry on. So what we often talk about as well when we talk about climate change is what it's a result of. And largely, obviously, it's greenhouse gas emissions. This is a pie chart of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK in 2018. And it's neatly divided into kind of different sectors. So you can go, oh, okay, right, transport is responsible for 28% of greenhouse gas emissions from the UK. So all we need to do is reduce that. Really simple. Same energy supply, residential, business, it's all neatly separated. What I'd argue is that actually it's not that neat. These things all have assumptions and definitions behind them that are much messier. So, you know, the energy supply and what the energy supply does affects what people do in their homes, and carbon emissions from homes, it affects business. And just some really simple examples of that are things like, for the last year, a lot of us have been working at home. So the carbon emissions when you're sat at home working and you have your heating on during the daytime, is that a residential carbon emission or is that a business carbon emission? And where you're charging your electric bike at home maybe in order to go to the shops, is that a business emission? Is it a personal residential emission, or is it a transport emission? The food that you buy, and how you get to the shop, where do all these things come together? And I think the point that I would make is that it's kind of helpful for policymakers to have these kind of big abstract numbers to work to, but actually for us wanting to do something about it, it's sometimes more useful to think about things at a neighbourhood level. These are some drawings from a workshop that I did a few years ago in my hometown in Workington. And it was a couple of days with a group of kids and people from one of the local housing associations talking about what they could do in their neighbourhood to tackle climate change. And the ideas came flowing really fast when you're talking about, okay, well, there's loads of waste heat from the factory that makes crisp packets there, so couldn't we use that to heat our swimming pools, and couldn't we put solar panels on all the roofs of our houses? And it makes it all kind of tangible and real. And I think there's another thing to consider as well, in that it's not just about personal responsibility or systems change. Those two things go together. This is my colleague Lorenza, who I think might be on the call. This is her cargo bike. And one of the things we try to do at URBED is we don't have company cars, we travel by public transport, a lot of us cycle. I turn up at construction sites on my bike. At first, people thought I was bonkers. But as I do it more and more, people start to see that as being normal. Same as not flying. So I don't fly. At first, many members of my family thought I was nuts. Now, more of them are thinking, oh, okay, right, this is part of a bigger thing. How can I get on my next holidays without getting on a plane, when we all are allowed to have any kind of holiday again? So the links between the personal and the systemic, and again, it's about making those links at a kind of local level, real and tangible. I always stick this one in because if you've not seen it, but you should have done, but it isn't, essentially, it's not just about climate change and the climate emergency, it's about making better lives. So I would really appreciate it if we had less pollution, because it would affect asthma and things like that a lot less. And that's one of the impacts that we would have if we also reduced carbon emissions. So all of these things are interconnected. Before Helen talks, I'm just going to very briefly talk a little bit about how some of this plays out, what we're doing with Homebaked in Anfield, which some of you will be familiar with. So you may have seen this image before. So this is, we're refurbishing terrace of houses, bringing them back into use as both residences and businesses. But in doing that, we're trying to address a lot of things that are to do with climate emergency, but also health and well-being and creating better local economies. So super insulated homes with fossil-free heating, with on-site power generation, green infrastructure. All of these things, again, it's not, you can't just say, okay, well, we've created some bike parking spaces, that's it, we've sorted that. We have to think about how that works in with everything else, if there's going to be bike charging places and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a very, very quick run through of some of the things that we think about a fair bit, and what my colleague Helen is going to do. There will be a chance to ask questions after Helen's done her bit as well, so we can come back to all of this. I will stop sharing my screen, and Helen is, Helen, if you can unmute.
Yeah. Okay. Hello.
Okay, so Helen is a geographer. Rather than so I'm an architect by training, Helen's a geographer, and Helen's going to talk about some of the local impacts of climate change and some examples of what people have done about it. So are you able to share your screen, Helen?
Yeah, I think. Oh. Let's try again. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Yes, so hang on, let me see if I can move on. So yeah, hi, I'm Helen. So I work with Marianne at URBED. So a lot of our work at URBED crosses a range of scales. So we do stuff that is right at kind of looking at spatial frameworks for a regional level through to kind of building level strategies. So Homebaked terrace obviously being one of those kind of projects. My particular interest, I guess, is how learning at a neighbourhood, building and street scale can inform a lot of other things. And so some of the most interesting bits of my job are around kind of post-occupancy and building performance evaluation and research. So kind of understanding what does and doesn't work well on completed projects, we believe is really important, so that you don't keep on repeating mistakes when you do another project. But also so that you don't end up creating perverse outcomes as well. So Marianne has kind of touched a little bit on some of the kind of climate impacts that we might be looking at over the next few decades. I think this is quite a useful summary slide, which is from the climate change risk assessment from a few years ago. So kind of there's two things that I'm going to touch on today, partly because I only have 10 minutes, but they are kind of overheating and flooding. And I think they're quite good examples of why we need to tackle challenges at a range of scales, because none of those, kind of neither overheating nor flooding, are things that are solved by a golden bullet or a technological add-on at the end of the project. And they actually got very real consequences for residents as well. So firstly, overheating. So climate change generally means hotter, drier summers and probably warmer, wetter winters. And contrary to the pictures that the press kind of always go with of heat waves, of kind of people frolicking in fountains and lying in a park, sunbathing. These are actually kind of really dangerous events that our buildings and health services are not really equipped to deal with particularly well. And these risks are also greatest for vulnerable groups as well. So elderly, young children and people with existing health conditions are particularly vulnerable to heat. So this map is of the kind of Liverpool region. So it kind of shows how personal, social and environmental factors combine with the likelihood of high summer temperatures. So it uses climate modelling for that kind of evidence base. And it helps us understand how that some of that social vulnerability and potential weather events will translate into disadvantage. So it's considering things around sensitivity, so people's age and health, how exposed they are, whether that be through the physical environment and buildings, and also maybe at a kind of neighbourhood level, what their capacity to prepare, respond and recover from those events might be. So this is some data from some post-occupancy research that we did, and this is interesting because it can tell us lots about whether things like the layout, the building form, the building fabric, ventilation strategy are minimising risk or conversely causing an issue. And arguably the most valuable data you ever get is that gets reported by residents. So this is an example from a refurbished apartment, which is the red line, and a second floor new build apartment. And these are part of the same development in London. And this was data from one of the hottest recorded June days a few years ago. So from the refurb, you can see that there are temperatures of nearly 28 degrees C at midnight, and then it rises to a peak of about 41 degrees C in the middle of the day. And we actually think that the data logger was probably underneath a roof light at that point, which explains that really short peak. But kind of regardless of that, you know, you've got temperatures of about 30 degrees C long after sunset, and this is in a development that was done within the last few years. And you might think that the new build would be better because surely we're kind of doing this stuff now. But actually that's still high. So it's still peaking at 29 degrees C in the evening, and it's still nearly 28 degrees C by midnight. So these are very real and kind of quite dangerous things that we're not really coping with very well in terms of building and kind of development design. So I've put a link in here and we'll share some more of these links at the end. But this kind of overheating guidance and toolkit is a really good example of why you need to consider an issue like overheating at a range of scales. So, you know, it really flags that the geography matters. So, you know, thinking about whereabouts you are in the UK, if it's an urban area, then that matters because you may be more likely to experience urban heat island effect, where in essence, your temperatures will be in the evenings in particular, maybe 3 or 4 degrees higher than a rural area, just because of the materials that store heat. What are there green and blue spaces nearby that might help with cooling? The site matters as well. So, you know, you can think about having openable windows, great, but if you're located next to a kind of a big arterial road, then actually those windows might not be used as you intended them to be. And then there's other things as well to consider, like air quality, safety, whether there are kind of adjacent uses that might, you know, produce a lot of cooking smells, and that might put people off opening windows. And then other things as well that get into kind of the nitty-gritty of building design as well. These are all things that you need to kind of consider to kind of tackle the challenge in the whole. So the next example is around flooding, which again Marianne touched on. So it's highly likely that the number of days with really heavy rainfall will increase, and this means we're probably going to be contending with much more flooding. So you know, areas that have never historically flooded before, we might expect them to get more surface water flooding events in particular. So I think it is something that we all need to have an eye on when it comes to a neighbourhood level. So we did some research for Cumbria Action for Sustainability a few years ago. So we looked at the kind of environmental impacts of flood recovery. And, you know, that research highlighted that the average domestic claim is around £50,000. There's obviously a massive amount of displacement and hardship that goes along with being flooded. So in many cases, people are out of their homes for more than a year. That has energy impacts because obviously you're then heating a home, heating a room, and also there's a massive amount of energy used in the actual drying out of the property as well, so that you can then get it back into a state that's livable. And we also find that waste to landfill from one flood event is probably equivalent to a total household waste for a year. So you can see that if we're getting repeat flood events in particular areas, there's massive environmental and kind of carbon impact from that as well. So we also looked a little bit at what happens when that reinstatement work takes place, and it's very obvious that the kind of the dominant approach is like for like. There's a lot of reasons why that happens, and insurance policies are kind of a key driver for that. But obviously people understandably want to get back into their homes quickly, which means that it's kind of like, let's just put it back to how it was rather than spend a little bit more time kind of planning and maybe incorporating some of the works at the same time that would make it more resilient in the longer term, but also maybe provide opportunities for kind of improving energy efficiency at the same time. I mean, flood reinstatement is actually an ideal time to do energy efficiency work because you're already kind of stripping it back to kind of the brick in a lot of cases. So, how great would it be if the norm was actually to do that work to make property more flood resilient, but also to support local jobs, build local supply chains, and reduce the contribution that the homes will make to climate change in the first place. And that project was also interesting because it showed how community level approaches can really deliver a lot of benefits. So there's some great examples of how taking a street or neighbourhood approach can improve not only resilience at a property level, but also the capacity of the community to respond and recover more quickly. So we found examples of where community approaches can improve levels of engagement because they generally involve a lot more consultation, so they're kind of generally more sensitive and responsive to resident needs. They could improve effectiveness of measures, so there's some really great examples of community flood groups who kind of regularly train and maintain the kit, and it also means that they can deploy it really quickly and effectively when a flood event does come along. And they're just generally kind of more proactive rather than kind of reactively responding to a flood event. And then the other thing just to say around flooding is that thing about thinking a little bit bigger than just the property. So thinking about maybe how green infrastructure can help to deliver some of these benefits as well. So rather than seeing things as discrete, discrete things in isolation, it's about thinking about ways that you can deliver multiple benefits. So, landscape as habitat and biodiversity, it's a good way of cooling urban heat islands. It's good in water management, not only reducing runoff and kind of flood risk from that, but also improving water quality. Just a connection to nature, being able to look out of your window and look out on something like that rather than a sea of tarmac. And then other kind of improvements as well, like buffering air quality. So this is a picture from Greater Green, which is a scheme in Sheffield city centre. And actually the most noticeable thing for me as a pedestrian walking along that space was the way that it feels like you're being buffered from what is like a really busy road. You've got this really big strip of really biodiverse and rich landscape, and you feel kind of protected slightly from kind of all of the nasties that's on the road as a result of that. So I guess in summary, our take on it would be that sort of any approach to retrofitting neighbourhoods and kind of zero carbon, that it is always a bigger picture. So it's also about health and well-being, and how we build resilience and adaptation has to be a part of that too. So that's it.